Hello, my name is James Whittaker, and I'd like to ask you to remove all the ferrous objects from about your person before I welcome you to the first episode of what I'm optimistically calling Season 2 of Conditional 1, my occasional podcast that focuses on all aspects of MRI safety. So, it's been the best part of 2 years since I've done anything with Conditional 1, with Episode 7, Lest We Forget, being released for the MRI Safety Week of 2023. I've been asked by a couple of people that I've met at conferences and study days if I'd stop doing this, but in the words of Mark Twain, rumours of my demise have been much exaggerated. I have, however, had quite a busy time of it out in the real world since my last episode. I've been involved in the selection and installation of a new MRI scanner at the practice I currently work at. I've presented on safety topics at national and international conferences, and with my daughter now off at university studying medicine, my wife and I have just been making the most of the ability to take off and enjoy life at a moment's notice. That said, I've been procrastinating about this episode throughout that whole period, basically, for one pretty simple reason. I just didn't feel that I had as strong an understanding of radiofrequency and its safety implications as I should. Albert Einstein said it best, I think. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I've very much taken that to heart. However, last year I was asked to present on B1 plus RMS at a study day in Christchurch. I originally tried to decline on the basis that what I understood about the subject would fit on a beer mat, but the response to that was basically, yes, but that's more than a lot of people. So, motivated to not stand in front of my peers and look like a complete idiot, I did some reading, thought about stuff, and eventually managed to fill some of the gaps I felt I had in my knowledge. The audience was receptive, and it gave me the confidence to finally pull my finger out and start putting this episode together. So, here we go. Now, for a long time, when I explained to patients how MRI worked, I'd say it used strong magnets and radio waves to take the pictures. As explanations go, it has the advantage of being simple and easy to understand. Unfortunately, it has the disadvantage of being at least partially wrong. MRI doesn't use radio waves as such, not the ones that old folks like myself used to listen to classic rock anyway. Instead, it uses radio frequencies as a way to transfer energy. To understand why that's the case, we'll need to talk physics for a moment. MRI works by using the magnetic properties of hydrogen atoms, or more specifically, hydrogen nuclei, to our advantage. The hydrogen nucleus, made up of a single proton, has a tiny positive electrical charge. And as we've discussed in Season 1, Episode 5, Lost in Translation, a moving electrical charge will generate a magnetic moment. When exposed to the static magnetic field, B0, in an MRI scanner, the magnetic moment of the hydrogen nucleus will be drawn into alignment with the direction of the static field. Nothing is ever as simple as it first appears, though, and the magnetic moment doesn't just align perfectly with the external magnetic field. Instead, it rotates around the axis, a movement known as precession. The speed at which this precession takes place varies with the strength of the external magnetic field and can be calculated using something known as the Larmor equation. The Larmor equation states that the precessional frequency is equal to the static magnetic field strength multiplied by the gyromagnetic ratio. Fortunately, the gyromagnetic ratio of hydrogen is a constant, and all hydrogen nuclei will precess at the same speed at any given field strength. The gyromagnetic ratio is 42.576 MHz, or a fraction over 42.5 million spins per second. So, at 1 Tesla, hydrogen nuclei precess at 42.576 MHz. At 1.5 Tesla, they precess at 63.8 MHz. And at 3 Tesla, they precess at just under 128 MHz. But what's that got to do with radio frequencies, I hear you ask? Well, Radio waves make up a relatively small part of the electromagnetic spectrum and include frequencies between 300 kilohertz and 300 megahertz. Above that, it gets a bit confusing as to whether they're radio waves or microwaves. At 7 Tesla, the precessional frequency is 298 megahertz, so right on that boundary. So why does this matter? Well, for magnetic resonance imaging, we're discussing transfer of energy into what we're interested in imaging, in most cases a patient, so the key word here is resonance. There are a couple of ways that I've tried to explain this to my students in the past, but perhaps the easiest way, or at least the one that most people are familiar with, or can try themselves, is to take a wine glass, wet the tip of your finger, and rub it around the rim. If you start and stop, you'll get short periods of vibration and sound, like this. If you keep going at just the right speed, or frequency, you'll get a constant tone as the glass begins to resonate, like this. Alternatively, imagine you're pushing someone on a swing, trying to get them higher and higher. If you don't push at the right moment, you can't give the swing the energy it needs, and a lot of your effort's wasted. So, how exactly do we use the RF coils in our scanner to push our swing? What makes the wine glass sing? 2 words: electromagnetic induction. When we turn on our radio frequency, we generate a changing magnetic field at the Larmor frequency. This is often referred to as B1. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, a changing magnetic field creates or induces an electric or E field within the tissues. This E field causes charged particles, like ions and electrons, in the tissues to move, and the induced E field interacts with the hydrogen nuclei, protons, in the tissues, causing them to resonate. That resonance is the basis of the MR signals we are trying to capture and gives us our images. Sounds good, right? This is an MRI safety topic, though, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. So, when the RF coils produce their oscillating magnetic fields and generate E fields within the patient tissue, it isn't a 100% efficient process. The human body absorbs some of the energy, which is converted into heat within the tissues, in a similar way to how a microwave oven heats food. As RF energy continues to be absorbed, the temperature of the tissues increases, and this can potentially lead to thermal injuries if the temperature rise is significant and not properly managed. For safety, we have to be aware of the rate at which RF energy is absorbed by the body, and this measurement is known as the specific absorption rate, or SAR. SAR is measured in watts per kilogram and is estimated for each sequence in an MRI examination based on patient weight. Different manufacturers generate their SAR estimations in different ways, so even assuming that you could run exactly the same sequence on the same patient on 2 scanners from different manufacturers, the SAR information you would receive would be different. The reason for this disparity is that SAR is extraordinarily complex to calculate, and there are a number of variables to be aware of. Firstly, SAR is proportional to the square of the field strength. Well, more accurately, it's proportional to the square of the frequency of the RF, which is determined by the Larmor frequency. So, if you perform the same scan at 3T compared to 1.5T, the SAR will increase by a factor of 4. If you move up to 7T, your SAR is almost 22 times greater, and then at 10T, it's 44 times greater. Huge numbers. Secondly, SAR is proportional to the electrical conductivity of body tissue. Just as human tissues have different imaging characteristics due to their differing proton density and fat and water composition, the conductive properties of tissue vary from type to type. For instance, bone is not a good conductor, and neither is lung. Blood and urine, though, as they contain more water, are by contrast excellent conductors, at least in terms of biological tissue. Metal objects, such as pacing wires, are designed to be conductive, which is why they can cause us such issues in the MRI environment. But I'm going to talk about that in more detail another time. Finally, with regards to the patient at least, SAR varies hugely with patient size. Dr. Alan Elster of MRIQuestions.com explains it simply and in stages. In a 2D model, he found that SAR was proportional to the square of the cross-sectional area of the body being imaged. Because cross-sectional area equals pi multiplied by the radius squared, we can determine that SAR is proportional to the radius tesseracted, which is a fancy way of saying multiplied to the fourth power. However, even the slimmest of humans aren't two-dimensional structures, so when the third dimension is considered, SAR is more closely proportional to radius multiplied to the fifth power. Not only that, but SAR tends to be greater around the periphery, so this is a double whammy for larger or obese patients. Okay, so how high can SAR go? As usual, with MRI, there isn't a single easy answer. It depends what part of the body you're scanning and why. In the 1990s, the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, developed the first international standards for SAR in MRI and codified the 3 scanning modes that we use today. Those 3 modes are known as normal mode, first level, and second level. Normal mode is designed to prevent excessive tissue heating and potential adverse effects during the scan. When we're using the receive-only coils with the ball-mounted RF transmit coil, we have to consider what is known as whole-body SAR. The upper limit of normal mode is 2 watts of RF energy per kilogram of patient weight. This is why we need an accurate weight for all patients undergoing MRI scans. First level is limited to 4 watts per kilo and is the highest SAR mode that can be used clinically. Second level has no upper limit and is used solely in the research setting. Obviously, because this is MRI and nothing is ever simple, there is more to be considered. For instance, when using transmit-receive coils, the localized SAR can be much higher, with extremity limits of up to 40 watts per kilo at first level. Though these limits are based on guesstimated vendor algorithms. After all, how exactly do you weigh how much a wrist weighs? So, where do these limits come from exactly? Well, it's actually less about how much you can heat a person up, as it is about how much they can cool down. An average person at rest generates about 1 to 1.5 watts per kilo of power. This is known as the basal metabolic rate, and varies with a number of factors, such as gender, age, weight, and level of fitness. The body should shed this heat and maintain a stable body temperature, known as thermoregulation. As we exercise, our metabolic rate goes up and we generate more heat, which we can shed by sweating and vasodilation. That redness you get when you exert yourself is basically blood vessels, opening up so blood can get to the surface and be cooled before being recirculated. For intense exercise, the body can generate up to 10 watts per kilo, but only for relatively short periods, because we're not able to dissipate that much heat and our body temperature goes up until we overheat. Dependent on the level of temperature rise, we can get cramps, we can become nauseous, or in extreme cases have seizures or even die. The human body can thermoregulate effectively up to around 2 to 3 watts per kilo under normal conditions. Beyond this range, the body's ability to shed heat through sweating and blood circulation loses efficiency, increasing the risk of overheating. Understandably, we don't want to heat our patients up so much that we kill them, so SAR limits are designed to prevent this. At normal level, basal metabolic rate plus absorbed RF energy should give rise to a core temperature increase of less than 0.5 degree Celsius in a patient able to thermoregulate normally. At first level, the increase is limited to 1 degree Celsius, which is why we should always monitor our patients whenever we use it. The ability to thermoregulate effectively is, of course, based on the idea of a fit and healthy individual, which patients undergoing MRI seldom are. What other factors can affect someone's ability to thermoregulate? Well, lots of patient populations can have issues with thermoregulation, and we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. Our patients may struggle due to medical conditions, injuries, or environmental factors. For example, older adults. Aging decreases sweat gland function, making heat dissipation less effective due to a reduced sweat response. Individuals with metabolic disorders such as hypothyroidism. An overactive thyroid can lead to excessive heat production, making individuals more prone to overheating. Diabetes, on the other hand, can affect blood flow and sweating, making thermoregulation through heat dissipation less effective. The hypothalamus controls human temperature control, and the hypothalamus can be affected by a number of neurological conditions, but I'll talk about that just a little later. Medications can affect a patient's ability to thermoregulate. Sedatives and opioids can reduce sweating and impair heat loss. Antihypertensive drugs can affect blood vessel dilation, altering heat regulation, and anesthetics can interfere with normal thermoregulatory responses. Chronic diseases can also affect thermoregulation. Heart disease can lead to poor circulation, reducing the ability to dissipate heat via vasodilation. Even skin diseases and disorders can affect thermoregulation, which makes sense when you think about it. Eczema and psoriasis can affect sweating and heat dissipation, while burns victims can lose the ability to effectively regulate temperature due to the disorganized nature of scar tissue. Did you know that patients with spinal cord injuries can have issues with thermoregulation? I didn't, until I started researching this episode. Damage above T6 can disrupt autonomic control of temperature because it's controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, which originates in the thoracolumbar region. Meanwhile, the parasympathetic nervous system, which originates in the brainstem, continues to function normally. Without the balance of the two systems, the patient can suffer from low blood pressure and decreased heart rate, which in turn leads to difficulties with thermoregulation. As a final point in our discussion of SAR, head SAR, when using a receive-only head coil, is 3.2 watts per kilo in normal and first level. Why is this the case? Well, I spoke earlier about basal metabolic rate and how the human body can shed heat over and above what is normally produced. The brain is a bit of an outlier in that even at rest, doing air quotes even though you can't see them, even at rest, the brain is working pretty hard. Though we've all met people that may give the lie to that statement. To give a bit of context, the brain is approximately 2% of the average person's body weight, but consumes almost 20% of the energy that we need on a daily basis. So the human brain runs hot even under ideal circumstances. Secondly, the brain is constrained by the skull. Why is that relevant? Well, the brain can transfer heat out via the cerebrospinal fluid and also via blood circulation, but this is potentially less effective than for other parts of the body. The skull doesn't transfer heat as effectively as our soft tissues do, so for heat to be shed, it has to passively transfer through the skull to the scalp, which can then sweat to cool itself. And if things weren't complicated enough, the body's vasodilatory response to heat is governed by the hypothalamus, which can be affected by stroke, traumatic brain injury, or neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. It can also be affected by autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis or lupus, and infectious or inflammatory causes like encephalitis or meningitis. And what do all these things have in common? They're common indications for someone to undergo MRI of the brain. So, we have to be especially careful when exposing the head to RF so our patient doesn't end up with boil-in-the-bag brain. Now, I think it's fair to say we've covered SAR and what it means to us as MRI technologists. However, SAR isn't the be-all and end-all. It's a reasonably good way to estimate the generalized heating effect of an MRI examination, but it's distinctly limited when it comes to determining more focal heating effects. To do that, we need another tool, and for many years now, that tool has been B1 plus RMS. Next episode, I'll explain what that is and how it works in more detail. But for now, I think that's a good place to call it a day for episode 1 of the new season. Don't worry, episode 2 is less than 2 years away, I promise. As always, I'd like to say thank you to Purple Planet for the use of their music, as well as Just Kidding and Herbert Boland of freesound.org for the sound effects. I'd also like to thank James Whittaker for proofreading and graphic design. If you have any questions about the content of this podcast, or ideas for future episodes of Conditional One, please email me. My email address is podcast@conditionalone.com. And remember, if anyone ever tells you that being an MRI technologist isn't rocket science, tell them no, but it is nuclear physics. Goodbye.